With the Overwatch League moving into its second week, North American action continues on a slightly lighter schedule than what we had during the opening weekend, with there only being 9 matches across Friday, Saturday and Sunday. Just like last week, today I want to discuss the matches scheduled for this upcoming weekend, giving my predictions for who I think is going to win, before ending by quickly looking at what happened with my predictions over this past week. Just before I start, I want to quickly let people know that I posted my Overwatch League Power Rankings update last night, but it appears that some people didn't see it show up in their feeds, so be sure to check it out after this video, and I'll link it down in the description below. So looking now at my weekly predictions for this week, starting with tomorrow, Friday, the first series of week 2 pits the Vancouver Titans against the Florida Mayhem. On paper this should be a pretty comfortable win for Florida, which is why you can see that I predicted they win 3-1. But the nature of how the Mayhem win, and indeed how the Titans perform, I do think could be quite significant. Florida is in a weird spot at the moment, as I'm not too sure they're good enough to seriously challenge for 6 or 7 NA teams I rate above them currently. However, following their win against Paris last week, I also don't think they're going to be mixing it up with the bottom 5 either. A comfortable win here would perhaps confirm that they are this year's NA gatekeepers, which although potentially disappointing in one aspect, would be a great foundation to start this year on, especially as this is a team that's still developing, both individually, with lots of the Mayhem players being rookies, but also in terms of the chemistry of one another. As for Vancouver, I think that even if they don't win, we need to see some fight from them, as they have what I reckon is a very winnable series a day later against New York, and they can't be going into that must-win contest on the back of 2 back-to-back dominant losses, to London last week and potentially Florida here. Following this series is perhaps the Overwatch League match that I'm most interested in watching this weekend, as the Houston Outlaws take on the San Francisco Shock. There are multiple different avenues to explore with this contest, but the first thing that I'm curious about seeing is whether Houston decide to continue with Dante on Doomfist, as if he does, this would lead to what should be a very telling matchup between the popular Doom and Winston styles that we've seen different teams play throughout the opening weekend. Now last week we got a hint at how this clash of styles might conclude, as Dallas struggled initially into Houston's Doom. But as they then quickly went into a mirror matchup, it's hard to assess whether the Doomfist solo tank was truly the better pick over the course of an entire series. This is why I'm hoping that we get to see this hero head-to-head during this match between the Outlaws and Shock, as it should give us a much better idea as to which comp is superior in certain circumstances, with Houston being one of only 2 teams to fully embrace the solo tank Doom, whereas San Francisco for my money executed Winston the best in week 1. If you've watched my power rankings video, you'll know that I personally believe stronger in the Winston comp compared to Doomfist, which is why I'm giving Shock the slight edge here in a 3-2 win. But this series should at the very least paint a clearer picture as to whether I'm right or wrong. The other aspect to this series that I'm interested in is whether we've accurately judged both of these teams after week 1, as I would say generally, most people rate these teams in the top 3 or 4 of the West region currently. That said, their performances last week still left some lingering questions, as we don't know if the Outlaws are a top team, having produced very different displays against the Fuel and Defiant, whilst the Shock have only wins against relatively weak competition to their name. So this match certainly could highlight if these teams are real competitors at the top of NA, or just week 1 pretenders. Friday concludes with the Atlanta Reign vs the Washington Justice, a series that I feel will go one of 2 ways. Either Atlanta continues to dominate with their own Doomfist in the face of another disappointing display from the Justice, or Washington are able to channel one of their better performances, with a game plan prepared to deal with their opponent's Doom. Based on what we've seen from the Justice though, and considering their recent track record, I have a feeling Atlanta will end up victorious here 3-1. Aside from the prospect of Decay and Happy simply being beaten by Kai and Nero in the DPS matchup, I'm more terrified that the Reign, led by Hawk's Doomfist, is going to exploit what I think is Washington's greatest weakness, their support line, resulting in a less competitive affair than we're hoping for. I've given Washington a map though, as I do think they have potential to stick with Atlanta in moments, especially if Mag is a consistent nuisance to the Reign's backline, and also if Happy and Decay are firing on all cylinders. That's not even mentioning the fact that like we saw against the Mayhem last week, Atlanta can sometimes run into a bit of trouble, and their momentum can stall, given they are so committed to running the Doom, even in situations where it isn't perfect, so it will be interesting to see how this one pans out. Moving into Saturday, all 3 matches here on paper have the potential to be absolute bangers, and as you can see by my predictions, I think there's a chance they can all go either way. The first contest between the Boston Uprising and London Spitfire does look like a series between 2 very evenly matched sides. The main question though as to who will win comes down to whether or not Boston can adapt to and deal with London's Rhine comp that proved incredibly effective against Vancouver, a team that lost to both of these sides last week. If the Uprising are able to stop Haddy and those Spitfire's Rhine May rollouts, then I could see them finding some success here. But the reason I'm leaning towards London is my concerns over Boston's consistency, as evidenced in their 5-match series against the Titans. but I wouldn't be stunned if they do eventually come out with the dub here, even if I am predicting them to lose. In my opinion, Saturday's highlight match comes next, and it could be one of the most exciting series we see this weekend, as the LA Gladiators face the Dallas Fuel, a matchup between the two NA sides I had rated the highest heading into this season, but with both underwhelming somewhat in their openers. For the Fuel, it's all about continuing where they left off after a massive improvement in their impressive bounce-back 3-0 sweep over Washington to right the wrongs of their shock 3-0 loss to Houston earlier in the week. We all know that Dallas has the players and potential to be one of the West region's best teams this year. I just think they need to commit to what they know and not get suckered into a matchup that didn't favour them, like what happened with running the Doom into the Outlaws. On the flip side, the Gladiators may have 2 victories to their name, but should they perform at a similar level against the Fuel, as they did against Boston and New York, then I worry for their chances here. This series will be a particularly important test for their rookies, with Reiner having to go head to head with Fearless, which could prove to be a decisive matchup, whilst Patty Pan will need to have a much more measured performance to ensure that his team isn't put on the back foot at the start of teamfights, as although they kind of got away with it against weaker opposition, I can guarantee you that Dallas will put the Gladiators to the sword if they smell a weakness and opportunity they can exploit. The reason I've gone for a close 3-2 here is because there's just too much talent on both of these sides for me to think there'll be a clear winner on one side or the other, with the flex support battle between Fielder and Shu one to keep an eye on, whilst the duel between Sparkle Edison and Uns Kevster could create some fireworks. In the end though, I'm more confident that Dallas' defeat to Houston was more of a fluke overall, which is why I'm backing them to come out on top here. Rounding out Saturday is a very tasty contest between the New York Excelsior and the Vancouver Titans, with a win certainly being possible for both of these sides. Vancouver should probably see this as their last real chance of changing people's minds regarding ranking them as the worst team in the league, as with defeats already to Boston and London, it looks like they could be in for yet another year of pain if they lose here again. New York, meanwhile, will finally get a good chance to reveal their true ability, as although they looked really poor against the Gladiators and Reign, both of those sides are currently undefeated, so it's hard to judge whether the Excelsior are a team that should be right at the bottom, or one that could be competing with those around the middle of NA. At the end of the day, I think New York come out on top. But as the Titans showed against the Uprising, when they aren't being steamrolled by Rhine comps, they can actually be quite competitive with some sides nearer the bottom of the West, which is why I'm backing them to take it to 5 maps, in spite of still losing in the end. Lastly on Sunday, the day begins with what should be an entertaining series between the Florida Mayhem and Houston Outlaws. Again, we should have a much clearer idea of how this series pans out after both of these teams play their first matches of the week on Friday. But unless Florida finds a brilliant strategy to deal with the Doom, I fear we're looking at a series that looks very similar to their 3-1 Week 1 loss to Atlanta, hence why I'm going with that scoreline. The Shock vs Excelsior match is another one I don't want to spend too much time on, as unless things drastically change from what we saw in Week 1, I would be very surprised if this series didn't end up in a comfortable 3-0 sweep victory for San Francisco. Just based on last week, there was nothing from New York to suggest they can seriously challenge teams in the upper half of North America. If anything, I think the best they can do is to try and take a map off the Shock, to show that they are improving and developing. Of course, assuming San Francisco and New York haven't managed to completely flip in quality from Week 1 to Week 2. Week 2 then concludes with the Toronto Defiance against the Paris Eternal. Interestingly, the only time we get to see these teams play all this weekend. On paper, assuming there isn't a drastic swing in form from week to week, it should be Toronto that comes out on top, as Paris didn't enjoy the greatest showing last week, with a more one-sided than I expected loss to the Mayhem that makes me think they'll struggle here. That said, I reckon this series will tell us a lot about the Defiant, who may have ended last week with an incredible win over the Outlaws, but still have many doubters, having lost weirdly to the Justice a day or two earlier. If they want people to really respect them as a top 5 side in NA, they have no choice but to convincingly deal with the Eternal here. Otherwise I fear they may be in the same boat as Washington, in being a team that roller coasters between good and bad performances, ending up stuck in the middle of the pack. In terms of how my predictions went last week, I finished with a record of 8 correct results to 5 incorrect results, which I think is alright considering the many unknowns heading into last weekend, not to mention the bizarre cycle of results between Houston, Dallas, Washington and Toronto. I should mention that if you are in my Discord, you can also cast votes as predictions for each match, and last week my Discord also went 8 and 5, so it's clearly all to play for between me and the Discord. On that note though, that's where I'm going to leave it today, so now I want to hear what you all think down in the comments below. If you enjoyed, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe. But until next time, I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.